It was the summer of 1992, in Marlow Creek, Texas, a town so small it didn't appear on most road maps. Population 1,847. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where front doors stayed unlocked, and where secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep. Brett Chandler was 28 years old that summer. He worked as a mechanic at Henderson's Auto Shop on Route 9, the only garage between Marlow Creek and the next town over, 15 miles east. He was lean, quiet, and dependable. The kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and never complained. He wore the same faded blue work shirt every day, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hands perpetually stained with engine grease no amount of soap could fully remove. Brett lived alone in a small rental house at the edge of town, a weathered white structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. He'd moved there 2 years earlier, after his mother passed away in a nursing home in Austin. No siblings, no wife, no children, just Brett and his routines. Every morning he'd stop at Sally's Diner on Main Street for coffee, black, no sugar, and a piece of toast. Sally Brennan, the owner, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned in a bun, would always greet him the same way. "Morning, Brett." "Morning, Sally." That was it. No small talk. No lingering. He'd leave $1.50 on the counter and walk out, truck keys jingling in his hand. His truck was a 1985 Ford F-150, dark green, with a dented front bumper and a cracked side mirror. It was parked in the same spot every morning, right outside the diner, under the shadow of the town's only traffic light. On Friday, July 17, 1992, Brett followed his routine, exactly as he always did. He arrived at Sally's Diner at 6:42 a.m. The sun was already burning through the morning haze, casting long shadows across Main Street. Inside, the diner smelled like burnt coffee and frying bacon. Sally was wiping down the counter when Brett walked in. "Morning, Brett." "Morning, Sally." He sat on the same stool he always sat on, third from the left, near the window. Sally poured his coffee without asking. Brett stared out the window while he drank, watching the town wake up. A few cars passed. Old Mr. Hiram shuffled by with his cane. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. At 6:58 a.m., Brett stood up, left his money on the counter, and walked out. Sally watched him go. She would later tell police that he seemed no different than any other. Day calm, unremarkable, normal. Brett climbed into his truck and drove the 3 miles to Henderson's Auto Shop. He arrived at 7:15 a meter. His boss, Dale Henderson, was already there, standing in the open garage bay, smoking a cigarette. Dale was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with graying hair and a permanent squint from years of staring into the sun. "Morning, Brett." "Morning, Dale." Brett grabbed his toolbox from the back of his truck and got to work. There were 2 vehicles waiting for him that day, a Chevy sedan with a busted alternator and a pickup with a failing transmission. Standard repairs, nothing unusual. The morning passed quietly. The radio in the garage played country music, static crackling between songs. The heat was oppressive, even in the shade. By noon, the thermometer outside the shop read 94 degrees. At 12:30 p.m., Brett took his lunch break. He always ate alone, sitting on an overturned crate behind the garage, away from the noise of the road. He brought the same thing every day: a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple, and a can of Coke from the vending machine inside. Dale saw him back there, eating in silence, staring out at the empty stretch of land behind the shop, a flat expanse of dry grass and scattered mesquite trees. At 1:00 p.m., Brett returned to work. At 4:47 p.m., he finished the transmission job. He wiped his hands on a rag, tossed it onto the workbench, and told Dale he was heading out. "See you Monday," Dale said, not looking up from the invoice he was writing. "See you Monday," Brett replied. He climbed into his truck and drove away. That was the last time anyone saw Brett Chandler. When Monday morning came, Brett didn't show up for work. Dale Henderson waited until 8 a.m. before he started to worry. Brett was never late, not once in 2 years. Dale called Brett's house. No answer. He called again at 9:00 a meter. Still nothing. At 10:30 a.m., Dale drove out to Brett's rental house. The truck wasn't in the driveway. The front door was locked. The windows were closed. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. The mailbox was overflowing. Letters and flyers spilled out onto the ground, unopened. Dale knocked on the door. No response. He walked around the side of the house, peering through windows. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed. The kitchen table was clear. The living room was tidy. No signs of a struggle. No signs of anything. Dale returned to his truck and drove back to the shop. He didn't call the police right away. He figured Brett had a reason for not showing up. Maybe he'd gone to visit someone. Maybe his truck had broken down somewhere out on the highway. It would make sense eventually. But by Tuesday, when Brett still hadn't appeared, Dale called the Marlow Creek Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Tom Whitmore took the report personally. He knew Brett, not well, but enough. Marlow Creek was small enough that the sheriff knew most people by name, at least in passing. Whitmore drove out to Brett's house on Tuesday afternoon. He found the same scene Dale had described: the overflowing mailbox, the locked doors, the silence. He radioed his deputy, a younger man named Carl Mundy, and told him to meet him at the house. Together, they knocked on the door. No answer. Whitmore made the decision to enter. He jimmied the lock with a flathead screwdriver, and the door swung open. Inside, the house was still. The air was stale, warm from days of being closed up under the Texas sun. Nothing appeared out of place. The bed was made. The dishes in the sink were clean. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner. But Brett was gone. His wallet was missing. His keys were missing. There were no notes, no signs of distress, no indication of where he might have gone. Whitmore and Mundy searched the house thoroughly. They found nothing unusual. Brett's closet was half empty, but that was normal. He didn't own much. A few pairs of jeans, some work shirts, a jacket. His toothbrush was still in the bathroom. His shaving kit was on the counter. In the living room, there was a small television set, a couch, and a bookshelf with a handful of paperback novels, westerns mostly. On the coffee table sat an ashtray with a single cigarette butt, ground out days earlier. The only item that stood out was a calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. It was turned to July 1992. There were no markings on any of the days except one. Friday, July 17. A small pencil mark, a single X, was drawn through the date. Whitmore stared at it for a long time. "What do you think it means?" Mundy asked. Whitmore didn't answer. He took the calendar down and brought it back to the station. By Wednesday, word had spread through Marlow Creek that Brett Chandler was missing. The town was small enough that news traveled fast, passed along in whispers at the post office, the grocery store, the diner. People began to speculate. Some said Brett had left town on purpose. He was a loner, after all. Maybe he'd gotten tired of Marlow Creek. Maybe he'd wanted a fresh start somewhere else. Others weren't so sure. Brett wasn't the type to just vanish. He was reliable, steady. If he'd wanted to leave, he would have said something. He would have given notice at work. He wouldn't have left his mail piling up. Sally Brennan, who'd served Brett coffee for 2 years, told anyone who would listen that something wasn't right. "He was here Friday morning, same as always," she said. "Didn't say a word about leaving. Didn't seem upset. Didn't seem like anything was wrong." Sheriff Whitmore organized a search party. On Thursday, July 23rd, nearly a week after Brett was last seen, a group of volunteers gathered at the sheriff's station. There were about 30 people, ranchers, shop owners, a few high school kids looking for something to do during summer break. They spread out across Marlow Creek and the surrounding area, searching fields, checking abandoned buildings, walking the banks of the dry creek bed that ran along the southern edge of town. They found nothing. No sign of Brett, no sign of his truck, no footprints, no discarded belongings, no clues. By the end of the day, the search was called off. Whitmore filed a missing persons report with the state police. He sent out a description of Brett and his truck to surrounding counties. He contacted hospitals, morgues, and jails within a 100-mile radius. Nothing came back. Brett Chandler had simply vanished. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. By the end of summer, people in Marlow Creek had stopped talking about Brett as much. Life moved on. The mechanic's position at Henderson's auto shop was quietly filled by a man from the next town over. Brett's landlord eventually cleared out the rental house and put it back on the market. Sheriff Whitmore kept the case file on his desk for a while, but eventually it was moved to a filing cabinet in the back room, tucked between other unsolved reports. Brett's truck was never found. No body was ever recovered. No witnesses came forward. It was as if Brett Chandler had driven out of Marlow Creek on that Friday afternoon in July and simply ceased to exist. But in a town as small as Marlow Creek, disappearances don't fade quietly. They linger. They haunt. They become part of the landscape, woven into the fabric of everyday conversation. For years afterward, people would occasionally bring up Brett's name, usually late at night, at the bar on the edge of town, after a few too many drinks. "You remember that mechanic who disappeared?" "Yeah, Brett something. Chandler. Wonder what happened to him. Probably ran off. Started over somewhere maybe. But no one really believed that. Because, in a town where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep, Brett Chandler had vanished without a trace. And 30 years later, the question still remained. Where did he go? The first year after Brett Chandler disappeared was the hardest. Not because there was hope. Hope fades quickly in a case with no leads, no body, no evidence. But because the absence itself became unbearable. It pressed down on Marlow Creek, like the heavy summer heat, inescapable and suffocating. Sheriff Tom Whitmore kept the investigation active as long as he could. He made phone calls. He followed up on tips that led nowhere. He drove out to neighboring counties, showing Brett's photograph to gas station attendants, motel clerks, diner waitresses. No one recognized him. No one had seen the green Ford F-150. By October 1992, the state police officially classified Brett Chandler's case as a cold case. The file was transferred to a regional task force that handled missing persons across several counties. It was added to a growing list of unsolved disappearances, names and faces that blurred together in photocopied reports, filed away in boxes that no one had time to reopen. Whitmore knew what that meant. The case would sit untouched unless new evidence surfaced. And new evidence almost never surfaced. Still, he didn't close the file. He kept it in his office, in the cabinet beside his desk, where he could see it every day. A reminder, a weight. In those early months, there were theories. Some people in Marlow Creek believed Brett had run away. He was a loner, they said. Quiet, private. Maybe he'd been planning it for weeks. Maybe he'd saved up money, packed a bag, and driven off to start a new life somewhere far away. California, maybe, or up north, where no one would recognize him. It was a comforting theory. It meant Brett was still alive, still out there somewhere, living under a different name, working a different job, away from the emptiness of Marlow Creek. But there were problems with that theory. Brett had left behind everything. His bank account, though modest, remained untouched. His paycheck from Henderson's auto shop, dated July 17th, was never cashed. His post office box continued to fill with mail, bills, advertisements, a birthday card from a distant cousin in Oklahoma who hadn't heard the news. If Brett had planned to disappear, he'd done a poor job of it. Others had darker theories. Maybe Brett had been killed. Maybe he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe he'd seen something he shouldn't have, heard something that made him dangerous. Marlow Creek was a small town, but small towns had secrets. Drugs moved through rural Texas in the early 90s. Quiet roads were useful for people who didn't want to be seen. Maybe Brett had crossed paths with someone who couldn't afford to leave witnesses. But there was no evidence of foul play. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no body. And without a body, murder was just speculation. Dale Henderson, Brett's boss, took the disappearance harder than most. He blamed himself, though he couldn't articulate why. Maybe it was guilt for not noticing something was wrong. Maybe it was the unsettling feeling that he'd been the last person to see Brett alive, and he'd let him walk away without a second thought. Dale kept working at the auto shop, but the place felt different now, quieter. The new mechanic he'd hired, a man named Luis Vega from the next town over, was competent. But he wasn't Brett. He talked more, laughed more, played the radio louder. Dale found himself thinking about that last conversation, over and over. See you Monday. See you Monday. Had Brett sounded different? Had there been something in his voice, some hesitation, some hidden meaning? Dale didn't think so. But memory was unreliable. The more he replayed the moment in his mind, the less certain he became. One evening in late November, Dale drove out to the spot behind the auto shop where Brett used to eat lunch. The overturned crate was still there, weathered and cracked, half buried in tall grass. Dale sat down on it and stared out at the empty land beyond. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dry Texas plains. The air was cool now, the oppressive heat of summer long gone. Dale lit a cigarette and smoked in silence. He never told anyone about these visits. He came back to that spot several times over the years, always alone, always at dusk, as if waiting for Brett to reappear and explain where he'd been. But Brett never came back. Sally Brennan, the owner of the diner, spoke about Brett often in the months after he vanished. She told customers, regulars, anyone who would listen, that something terrible must have happened. Brett wasn't the kind of man to just leave. He was steady, predictable, dependable. He sat right there, she'd say, pointing to the third stool from the left. Every single morning, same time, same coffee, same toast. Single quotes, she kept the stool empty for weeks, as if reserving it for him. But eventually, other customers needed a place to sit, and the stool was used again. Life moved forward, whether Sally wanted it to or not. Still, she never forgot. Years later, she would tell a reporter from a regional newspaper that she still thought about Brett sometimes. She'd see a green truck drive past the diner, and for a split second, her heart would jump. But it was never him. It was never his truck. "I don't think he left on his own," she said. "I think something happened to him out there, and I don't think we'll ever know what." By the spring of 1993, Marlow Creek had largely moved on. Brett Chandler's name came up less and less. The rental house he'd lived in was occupied by a young couple with a baby. Henderson's auto shop was busier than ever. The diner served coffee to new faces, people who'd never met Brett, who didn't know his story. Sheriff Whitmore still kept the file in his cabinet, but he stopped opening it. There was nothing new to add. No tips, no sightings, no breakthroughs. The case had gone cold, in every sense of the word. But disappearances don't truly end. They echo. In a town as small as Marlow Creek, Brett's absence became a permanent fixture. A gap in the landscape, a name that surfaced every few years when someone remembered, or when a new resident asked about the unsolved case that everyone seemed to know about, but no one wanted to discuss in detail. Time passed. 1994 became 1995. 1995 became 1996. The world changed around Marlow Creek. Technology advanced. The internet began to spread. Cell phones became more common. The town got its first ATM. The high school built a new gymnasium. But some things stayed the same. The auto shop, the diner, the single traffic light on Main Street, and the unanswered question of what happened to Brett Chandler. Sheriff Tom Whitmore retired in 1998. He was 62 years old, worn down by 3 decades of small-town law enforcement. His replacement was a younger man named Eric Lawson, who'd transferred in from a larger department in Austin. Lawson was efficient, organized, and unfamiliar with most of the old cases. When Lawson took over, he spent his first few weeks reviewing the filing system. He found Brett Chandler's file buried in a cabinet in the evidence room, along with dozens of other cold cases from the 80s and 90s. He skimmed the report. Missing mechanic. No leads. No body. No evidence. Lawson made a note in the system and moved on. There were more pressing matters. Active cases, current crimes. Brett Chandler became just another name in a long list of people who'd vanished and were never found. But in the homes of Marlow Creek, the memory persisted. Mothers told their children to be careful when they were out late. Fathers double-checked the locks on their doors at night. The disappearance had left a scar on the town, invisible but permanent. And in the back of everyone's mind, the question remained, if it could happen to Brett Chandler, a quiet, unremarkable man who'd lived in Marlow Creek for 2 years and never caused trouble, then it could happen to anyone. By the year 2000, 8 years had passed since Brett vanished. Dale Henderson was still running the auto shop, though he was older now, slower, his hair fully grey. Sally Brennan still owned the diner, though her hands shook a little more when she poured coffee. The town looked the same, but the people had aged, and Brett Chandler was still missing. No new evidence had emerged. No tips had come in. The case had been transferred to a state database, digitized and uploaded to a national registry of unsolved missing persons cases. His photograph, a grainy black and white image from his driver's license, was now accessible online, alongside thousands of others, but no one was looking. The silence had become absolute. In the summer of 2005, a journalist from Dallas visited Marlow Creek. She was writing a feature article on cold cases in rural Texas, and she'd come across Brett Chandler's name in a state archive. She interviewed Sheriff Eric Lawson, who gave her a polite but detached summary of the case. She spoke with Dale Henderson, who was reluctant to talk, but eventually shared a few memories. She sat in Sally's diner and listened to Sally tell the same story she'd been telling for 13 years. The article was published in a regional magazine in October 2005. It was 2 pages long, with a single photograph of Marlow Creek's Main Street and a sidebar listing other unsolved disappearances in the area. A few people in town read it. Most didn't. The article didn't generate any new leads. No one called the tip line. No one came forward with information. Brett Chandler remained missing, and so the years continued to pass. The town changed slowly. Businesses opened and closed. People were born. People died. The high school graduating class got smaller each year, as young people moved away to cities with more opportunity. Dale Henderson finally retired in 2009. He sold the auto shop to a man from out of town and moved into a small house near the edge of Marlow Creek. He spent his days fishing in a stock pond behind his property, sitting in silence, watching the water. Sally Brennan closed the diner in 2011. She was in her 80s by then, too tired to keep running the place. The building sat empty for a year before it was bought by a young couple who turned it into a thrift store. Sheriff Eric Lawson left Marlow Creek in 2013, taking a position with a larger department in Houston. His replacement was a woman named Angela Rivera, who'd grown up 2 towns over and had no memory of Brett Chandler's disappearance. The case file was still in the system, but by now it was buried under 2 decades of other reports. It was a name, a date, a few paragraphs of text, a photograph of a man no one remembered. By 2015, 23 years had passed since Brett Chandler vanished. Most of the people who'd known him were gone. Dale Henderson had passed away in 2012, quietly, in his sleep. Sally Brennan followed in 2014, her funeral attended by a small crowd of elderly residents who'd known her for decades. The new generation of Marlow Creek residents had never heard of Brett Chandler. His name meant nothing to them. The case had faded into obscurity, and yet, in the shadows of time, the truth was still there, waiting, hidden, buried beneath years of silence. It was a Saturday morning in October 2022. 30 years had passed since Brett Chandler disappeared. Marlow Creek had changed, not dramatically, but in the slow, inevitable way small towns evolve over decades. Main Street looked different now. The old hardware store was a coffee shop. The thrift store that had replaced Sally's diner was now a tax preparation office. The traffic light still hung at the intersection, swaying slightly in the wind, but the buildings around it had been repainted, repurposed, forgotten. Most of the people who'd lived in Marlow Creek in 1992 were gone, dead or moved away, or too old to remember clearly. The new residents were younger families, retirees looking for affordable housing, people who'd never heard the name Brett Chandler. The case file still existed somewhere in a digital database, but it hadn't been opened in years. There were no active investigators, no ongoing search, no hope of resolution. Brett Chandler had become a ghost story, a footnote in the town's history, until the morning of October 8, 2022. The day began like any other. A man named Garrett Bishop woke up early, just after dawn. He was 41 years old, a contractor who'd moved to Marlow Creek 5 years earlier with his wife and 2 kids. They'd bought a house on the outskirts of town, an old property that had been on the market for years, sitting vacant and neglected. The house needed work, a lot of work. But Garrett liked projects, and the price had been right. Over the past 5 years, he'd renovated most of the interior. New floors, new paint, updated plumbing. But there was one part of the property he'd been putting off, the old barn. It stood about 100 yards behind the house, half hidden by overgrown mesquite trees and tall grass. The structure was ancient, built sometime in the 1960s or earlier, with warped wooden walls and a rusted metal roof that groaned in the wind. Garrett's wife, Emily, had been asking him to tear it down for years. It's an eyesore, she'd say, and it's not safe. What if one of the kids goes in there and gets hurt? Garrett always promised he'd deal with it, but there was always something more urgent, something inside the house that needed fixing first. Until that Saturday morning in October, Garrett had finally decided it was time. He'd rented a small excavator and planned to spend the weekend clearing out the barn, tearing it down, and hauling away the debris. He pulled on his work boots, grabbed a pair of gloves, and walked out across the property toward the barn. The morning air was cool, the sky pale and overcast. The tall grass rustled around his legs as he walked. When he reached the barn, he stopped and stared at it for a moment. The front doors were hanging off their hinges, barely attached. The wood was rotted through in places, riddled with termite damage. Inside, the barn was dark, filled with the smell of decay and dust, and something else, something old and forgotten. Garrett pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was a mess. Rusted tools, broken furniture, stacks of old newspapers, and cardboard boxes that had been sitting there for decades. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, casting narrow beams across the dirt floor. Garrett began sorting through the debris, deciding what could be salvaged and what needed to be thrown away. Most of it was junk. But as he worked his way deeper into the barn, toward the back corner, he noticed something unusual. A tarp, dark green heavy-duty, covered in dust and cobwebs. It was draped over something large, something that took up most of the corner space. Garrett couldn't immediately tell what it was. He hesitated for a moment, then reached down and grabbed the edge of the tarp. He pulled. The tarp slid away, releasing a cloud of dust into the air. And beneath it, Garrett saw a truck. It was a Ford F-150, dark green, old, covered in decades of grime and dust. Garrett stared at it, confused. He hadn't known there was a vehicle in the barn. The previous owners, an elderly couple who'd moved into a nursing home before selling the property, had never mentioned it. The real estate agent hadn't said anything either. Garrett walked around the truck slowly, examining it. The tires were flat. The windows were filthy, almost opaque. The paint was faded, chipped in places. The front bumper was dented. The side mirror was cracked. He tried the driver's side door. It was unlocked. The door opened with a long metallic creak. Inside, the truck smelled of mildew and age. The seats were cracked and faded. The dashboard was coated in dust. On the passenger seat lay a folded map, yellowed with time. On the floor, a crushed soda can Coke, the logo barely visible beneath the rust. Garrett leaned in further, looking around. The glove compartment was closed. He reached over and popped it open. Inside were a few items: an owner's manual, a pack of cigarettes, a plastic lighter, and a registration document. Garrett pulled out the registration and unfolded it. The paper was brittle, fragile. The ink faded, but still legible. It read, "Owner, Brett Chandler, address, 482 Elm Street, Marlow Creek, Texas vehicle, 1985 Ford F-150, color, green, year, 1985. Garrett stared at the name for a long time. Brett Chandler. He didn't recognize it. He'd never heard of anyone by that name, but something about the situation felt wrong. This truck had been hidden in the barn for years, decades maybe. Someone had covered it with a tarp, concealed it, left it here to rot. Why? Garrett folded the registration and put it in his pocket. He stepped back from the truck and looked around the barn again, more carefully this time. That's when he noticed something else. On the ground, near the rear of the truck, partially buried beneath dirt and debris, was a leather wallet. Garrett picked it up. The leather was cracked and stiff, darkened with age. He opened it carefully. Inside, there was a driver's license. The plastic was cloudy, the photograph faded, but the name was still visible. Brett Allen Chandler, D.O.B. March 14th, 1964. Garrett's heart began to beat faster. He looked back at the truck, then down at the wallet in his hands. This wasn't just an abandoned vehicle. This was something else, something that had been hidden deliberately. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Sheriff Angela Rivera arrived at the property 40 minutes later, accompanied by 2 deputies. Garrett met them at the barn and explained what he'd found. Rivera listened carefully, her expression neutral, professional. She was in her late 40s, with short, dark hair and sharp eyes. She'd been sheriff of Marlow Creek for 9 years, and in that time, she'd dealt with plenty of unusual situations. But this was different. She stepped into the barn and approached the truck. The registration, the wallet, the driver's license. She ran the name through the department's database on her phone. It took less than a minute for the results to appear. Brett Allen Chandler. Missing since July 1992. Case status, cold. Rivera read the summary quickly. Mechanic. Last seen leaving work on a Friday afternoon. No evidence of foul play. No body ever recovered. No leads. She looked back at the truck. 30 years. This truck had been sitting in this barn, hidden under a tarp, for 30 years. Rivera radioed for a forensics team and a tow truck. She instructed her deputies to secure the scene and begin documenting everything. Over the next several hours, the barn became a hive of activity. Photographers, evidence technicians, investigators from the county. They searched the truck thoroughly. They found more items inside. A toolbox in the truck bed. A receipt from Henderson's auto shop, dated July 17, 1992. A half-empty pack of cigarettes on the dashboard, and a jacket draped over the passengers. But there was no sign of Brett Chandler himself. No body, no blood, no indication of violence. Just the truck, abandoned, hidden, waiting. The discovery made the local news that evening. By Monday, reporters from regional outlets had descended on Marlow Creek. The story spread quickly. A missing man's truck, found after 30 years, hidden in a barn on private property. The question everyone was asking was simple. How did it get there? Rivera began her investigation by tracking down the history of the property. The barn where the truck was found had belonged to a man named Leonard Hayes. He'd owned the land since the 1970s and had lived there until his death in 2016. His widow, Margaret Hayes, had remained in the house until 2017, when she moved into a nursing home due to declining health. Rivera drove to the nursing home and requested to speak with Margaret. The staff informed her that Margaret Hayes was 89 years old and suffering from advanced dementia. Most days, she didn't recognize her own children. She couldn't hold a coherent conversation. Rivera visited her anyway. Margaret sat in a wheelchair near a window, staring out at the courtyard. Her hands trembled in her lap. Her eyes were distant, unfocused. Rivera sat beside her and spoke gently. "Mrs. Hayes, my name is Angela Rivera. I'm the sheriff in Marlow Creek. I need to ask you some questions about your property, about the barn." Margaret didn't respond. She continued staring out the window. "Mrs. Hayes, do you remember a truck? A green Ford truck? It was in your barn. Do you know how it got there?" Still no response. Rivera tried a few more questions, but it was clear that Margaret was beyond reach. Whatever she might have known about the truck, it was locked away in a mind that could no longer access it. Rivera thanked the staff and left. The next step was to interview people who'd known Leonard Hayes. Leonard had been a private man, quiet and reclusive, especially in his later years. He'd worked as a ranch hand in his youth, then later as a handyman around town. He'd kept to himself, avoided social gatherings, and rarely spoke to neighbors. But he'd lived in Marlow Creek his entire life. Someone must have known him. Rivera tracked down a man named Curtis Finch, who'd worked alongside Leonard at a feed store in the 1980s. Curtis was in his 70s now, retired, living in a small house on the east side of town. Rivera sat with him on his porch and asked about Leonard. "Leonard was a strange guy," Curtis said, rocking slowly in his chair. "Didn't talk much, kept to himself. But he wasn't a bad person, just ... private, you know." "Did you ever visit his property?" Rivera asked. Curtis shook his head. "Never. Leonard didn't invite people over. I don't think anyone went out there except him and his wife." "Did you ever hear him mention Brett Chandler?" Curtis frowned. "Who?" "Brett Chandler, the mechanic who disappeared in 1992. Curtis thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, don't think so." Rivera thanked him and moved on. She interviewed a dozen more people over the next week. Former co-workers, neighbors, people who'd lived in Marlow Creek in the 90s. No one remembered Leonard Hayes having any connection to Brett Chandler. But someone had put that truck in that barn. Someone had covered it with a tarp and left it there for 30 years. And Rivera intended to find out who, as the investigation continued. Rivera returned to the barn several more times. She walked the property. She studied the layout. She tried to piece together a timeline. The barn was isolated, hidden from the main road by trees and distance. It would have been easy to drive a truck back there at night without anyone noticing. But why? If Leonard Hayes had killed Brett Chandler, why hide the truck but not the body? Why keep the evidence? Unless Leonard hadn't been the one who put it there. Rivera considered other possibilities. Maybe someone else had used the barn without Leonard's knowledge. Maybe the truck had been hidden there by a third party, and Leonard had simply never found it. Or maybe Leonard had known about it all along, and had chosen to stay silent. On the third week of the investigation, Rivera received a call from the forensics lab. They'd processed the truck and found something. A single fingerprint lifted from the driver's side door handle, partial, but clear enough to run through the system. The print didn't match Brett Chandler. It matched someone else. A man named Raymond Cole. Rivera pulled up Raymond Cole's record. He'd lived in Marlow Creek in the early 90s. He'd been arrested twice, once for assault in 1989, and once for drug possession in 1994. He'd left Texas in 1996, and hadn't been back since Rivera ran a current address search. Raymond Cole was still alive. He was living in New Mexico, just outside of Albuquerque. Rivera made a call to the local police department and requested assistance in locating him. 2 days later, she received confirmation. Raymond Cole had been found, and he'd agreed to speak with her. Sheriff Angela Rivera flew to Albuquerque on a cold November morning. The flight was short, less than 2 hours, but it felt longer. She sat in silence, staring out the window at the clouds below, running through the questions she planned to ask. She'd spent the past 3 weeks preparing for this moment, reviewing every detail of the case, every scrap of evidence. Raymond Cole was the first real lead in 30 years. and Rivera wasn't going to waste it. She met Cole at the Albuquerque Police Department, in a small interview room, with grey walls and fluorescent lighting. A local detective sat in the corner, observing, but this was Rivera's interrogation. Raymond Cole was 63 years old. He looked older. His hair was thin and grey, his face lined with deep wrinkles. He wore a faded denim jacket and jeans, his hands calloused and scarred from years of manual labor. He sat across from Rivera, slouched in his chair, arms crossed. He didn't look nervous. He looked tired. Rivera set a folder on the table between them and opened it. Inside was a photograph of the green Ford F-150, taken in the barn where it had been found. She slid the photo across the table. "Do you recognize this truck, Mr. Cole?" Raymond glanced at the photo. He didn't pick it up. He didn't lean forward. He just stared at it for a moment, then looked back at Rivera. "Yeah," he said. His voice was rough, gravelly. "I recognize it." Rivera kept her expression neutral. "How?" "Because I put it there." The room went silent. Rivera had expected denials, deflection, lies. But Raymond Cole had just confessed, plainly and without hesitation, to hiding the truck. She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me what happened." Raymond exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands over his face. He looked down at the table. "I didn't kill him," he said quietly. "I didn't kill Brett Chandler. I want you to know that first. Then, what did you do?" Raymond was silent for a long moment. Then he began to speak. "I knew Brett," Raymond said. "Not well, but I knew him. We weren't friends. We didn't hang out. But Marlow Creek's a small town. You see the same people over and over. You know who they are." Rivera listened, taking notes. "Back in '92, I was in a bad place," Raymond continued. "I was using meth, mostly. I was dealing too, small-time stuff, just enough to support my habit. I wasn't violent, I wasn't dangerous, but I was desperate." He paused, his jaw tightening. "On July 17th, I was supposed to meet a guy, a supplier. He was coming through Marlow Creek, on his way to another town, and we were supposed to do a deal out on Route 9, near the old Henderson's auto shop. Late afternoon, after the place closed, Rivera's pen stopped moving. Henderson's auto shop, that's where Brett Chandler worked." Raymond nodded. "Yeah, I didn't know he'd still be there. I thought the place would be empty. But when I pulled up, Brett was just leaving. He was getting into his truck, about to drive off." "Did he see you?" "Yeah. He saw me, and he saw the guy I was meeting. We were standing by my car, and the guy had a bag with him. Brett looked right at us. He didn't say anything. He just ... stared. And then he got into his truck and started the engine." Raymond's hands clenched into fists on the table. "The guy I was with, his name was Eddie Rourke." He panicked. He thought Brett was going to call the cops. He thought Brett had seen too much. So Eddie pulled a gun. Rivera's heart rate quickened. What happened next? "Eddie told Brett to get out of the truck. Brett did. He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He just got out, hands up, calm as anything. Eddie told him to walk into the shop. We all went inside." Raymond's voice was shaking now, barely above a whisper. "Eddie kept the gun on Brett. He was yelling, asking Brett if he was going to call the police, if he was going to say anything. Brett kept saying no. He kept saying he didn't see anything, that he was just leaving, that he wouldn't tell anyone. But Eddie didn't believe him." Raymond nodded. "Eddie was paranoid. He was high and he was scared, and he wasn't thinking straight. He told me to tie Brett up. There was some rope in the shop, and I tied Brett's hands behind his back. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. Eddie had the gun, and I thought if I didn't do what he said, he'd turn it on me." Rivera's voice was steady. "What happened to Brett?" Raymond closed his eyes. "Eddie kept him in the shop for a few hours. It was getting dark. Eddie was trying to figure out what to do. He was pacing, arguing with himself. I kept telling him to let Brett go, that Brett wasn't going to say anything, that we should just leave. But Eddie wouldn't listen." Raymond opened his eyes, staring at the table. "And then Eddie shot him." Rivera felt the air leave the room. She stared at Raymond, processing his words. "He shot him," she repeated. Raymond nodded, his face pale. "Once in the chest, Brett didn't even scream. He just ... collapsed. It was fast, too fast." Rivera's mind raced. "What did you do?" "I panicked. I wanted to call for help, but Eddie told me if I did, he'd kill me too. He said we had to get rid of the body. So we ... we wrapped Brett in a tarp from the shop. We put him in the back of Eddie's truck, and we drove out to the middle of nowhere, out past the county line, to a place Eddie knew, an old abandoned well, deep in the brush. Raymond's voice broke. We dumped him in the well, covered it with dirt and rocks, and then we drove back to town. Rivera's pen moved quickly across the page. What about Brett's truck? Eddie told me to move it. He didn't want it sitting outside the shop. He was afraid someone would notice it and start asking questions. So I drove it out to Leonard Hayes's property. Why there? Because Leonard owed me money. He'd bought some stuff from me a few months earlier, and he hadn't paid. I knew where he lived. I knew he had that barn out back. I figured I could stash the truck there for a few days until things cooled down, and then I'd get rid of it. But you never did. Raymond shook his head. No. A few days turned into a week turned into a month. I was too scared to go back. I thought if I touched that truck again, someone would see me. Someone would connect me to Brett. So I just, left it there. And I never told Leonard. I don't even know if he ever found it. Rivera leaned back in her chair, her mind working through the timeline. And Eddie Rourke. Where is he now? Raymond's expression darkened. Dead. He overdosed in 1995. Died in a motel room in Oklahoma. Rivera sat in silence for a moment, absorbing everything Raymond had told her. Then she asked the question that mattered most. Where is the well? Raymond looked up at her, his eyes red. I can show you. 3 days later, Rivera returned to Texas with a team of forensic investigators, cadaver dogs, and heavy excavation equipment. Raymond Cole had provided detailed directions to the location where he claimed Brett Chandler's body had been dumped. It was nearly 100 miles from Marlow Creek, deep in rural Texas, far off any main road. The area was desolate, flat scrubland, dotted with mesquite and cactus, stretching endlessly in every direction. The kind of place where no one ever went, where nothing ever changed. Raymond had described the well as being near a cluster of old fence posts and a rusted water tank. The team found the location within an hour. The well was there, just as Raymond had described. It was old, hand-dug, probably from the early 20th century. The opening had been partially filled in with dirt and rocks, overgrown with weeds and brush. The excavation began immediately. It took 2 full days of careful digging. The ground was hard, compacted by decades of wind and rain. But gradually, the well was cleared, and on the afternoon of the second day, at a depth of nearly 20 feet, they found remains. The bones were fragmented, scattered, weathered by time, but they were unmistakably human. A forensic anthropologist was brought in to examine the remains on site. Initial analysis suggested the bones had been there for decades. The clothing fragments found with the remains, a blue work shirt, denim jeans, matched the description of what Brett Chandler had been wearing the day he disappeared. DNA samples were collected and sent to a lab for comparison. 2 weeks later, the results came back. Positive match. The remains belonged to Brett Allen Chandler. The news spread quickly. After 30 years, Brett Chandler had been found. The case that had haunted Marlow Creek for decades was finally, officially, closed. Sheriff Rivera held a press conference on a gray December morning. She stood behind a podium outside the Marlow Creek Sheriff's Department, flanked by state investigators and county officials. She spoke calmly, methodically, outlining the facts of the case. The discovery of the truck, the fingerprint, the interrogation of Raymond Cole, the recovery of Brett Chandler's remains. Reporters asked questions. Rivera answered them as best she could. Will Raymond Cole be charged? Yes, he's being charged as an accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. The statute of limitations hasn't expired for those crimes. What about Eddie Rourke? Eddie Rourke is deceased. He can't be prosecuted. How do you think this will affect the community? Rivera paused, choosing her words carefully. I think it gives people closure. For 30 years, Brett Chandler's family, what little family he had, and the people of Marlow Creek lived with unanswered questions. Now at least, they have answers. In the weeks that followed, the story was covered by news outlets across Texas and beyond. Brett Chandler's name appeared in newspapers, on television, in online articles. People who'd never heard of him learned his story. People who'd forgotten him were reminded. And in Marlow Creek, the town where Brett had lived and worked and vanished, there was a quiet sense of resolution. Not closure, exactly. Not peace, but an ending, at least. Dale Henderson, the man who'd been Brett's boss, had died years earlier. He never knew what happened to Brett. He went to his grave still wondering, still haunted by that last conversation. Sally Brennan, who'd served Brett coffee every morning, was gone too. She never learned the truth. But the story survived them both. And in the end, the truth came out. Not because of good detective work, or advanced forensics, or new technology, but because a man named Garrett Bishop decided to tear down an old barn, because he found a truck hidden beneath a tarp, because he called the police instead of looking the other way, and because, after 30 years of silence, Raymond Cole finally told the truth. Brett Chandler was buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Marlow Creek. The funeral was modest. A few distant relatives attended, along with Sheriff Rivera and a handful of residents who still remembered Brett's name. There was no eulogy, no speeches, just a quiet gathering on a cold afternoon, beneath a gray Texas sky. The headstone was simple: Brett Allen Chandler, 1964 to 1992. Finally home. The story didn't end with Brett Chandler's funeral. In some ways, it had only just begun. The case had been solved. The body had been recovered. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But the questions remained, not about what happened, but about why it had taken so long. Why 30 years had to pass before the truth finally surfaced, and what it meant for everyone who'd been left behind. Raymond Cole was extradited back to Texas in January 2023. He was arraigned in a courtroom in the county seat, 20 miles from Marlow Creek. The charges were read aloud: accessory to murder, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence. He pleaded guilty to all counts. The sentencing hearing took place in March. Raymond sat at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him, his expression blank. He wore an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. His attorney, a public defender appointed by the court, spoke on his behalf, citing Raymond's cooperation with law enforcement, his full confession, and his remorse. The prosecutor argued that Raymond had spent 30 years living freely, while Brett Chandler's body rotted in an abandoned well, that he'd had countless opportunities to come forward, to do the right thing, and he'd chosen silence instead. The judge listened to both sides. Then he asked Raymond if he wanted to make a statement. Raymond stood slowly. He looked out at the courtroom, at the few reporters in the gallery, at Sheriff Rivera sitting in the front row, at the empty seats where Brett Chandler's family might have sat if he'd had any family left. He spoke quietly, his voice hoarse. "I know what I did was wrong," he said. "I've known it for 30 years. Every day, I thought about Brett. I thought about what happened to him. I thought about calling the police, turning myself in, telling someone, but I was a coward. I was scared, and I let that fear control me." He paused, his hands trembling. "I can't undo what happened. I can't bring Brett back. But I can tell the truth, and I did. I told Sheriff Rivera everything. I showed her where we left him, and I hope that gives someone, somewhere, some kind of peace." He sat down. The judge delivered his sentence without hesitation. 15 years in state prison. Raymond Cole would be 78 years old when he was released, if he lived that long. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his head bowed, and that was the last time anyone in Marlow Creek saw him. In the months following the trial, life in Marlow Creek returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. The news crews left. The reporters stopped calling. The story faded from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher scandals, more urgent crises. But for the people who'd lived through it, who'd known Brett or known of him, or simply lived in the town where he'd disappeared, the story lingered. Sheriff Angela Rivera kept a copy of the case file in her office, even though it was officially closed. She'd look at it sometimes, late at night, when the station was quiet and she was alone with her thoughts. She thought about Brett Chandler often, about the life he'd lived, quiet and unremarkable, and the way it had ended, violently, senselessly, at the hands of a man who was too high and too scared to think clearly. She thought about Raymond Cole, too, about the guilt he must have carried for 30 years, and whether it had been enough, whether anything could ever be enough. Mostly, she thought about the randomness of it all. How Brett had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. How a single moment, a glance, a witness, a transaction gone wrong, had cost him his life, and how easily it could have been anyone else. Garrett Bishop, the man who'd found the truck, tried to move on with his life, but it wasn't easy. The discovery had changed him. He couldn't walk past the barn, now demolished, reduced to a cleared patch of dirt, without thinking about what had been hidden there. Without imagining Brett Chandler driving that truck up the long driveway in the dark, unknowingly leaving it in the hands of someone who would bury the truth for decades. Garrett's wife, Emily, noticed the change. He was quieter now, more withdrawn. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and sit by the window, staring out at the empty land behind the house. "Are you okay?" she'd ask. "Yeah," he'd say. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. He'd stumbled onto something that had been hidden for 30 years. He'd uncovered a secret that had shaped the lives of everyone involved, even people who didn't know it existed. And he couldn't shake the feeling that if he'd torn down that barn a year earlier, or a year later, Brett Chandler might never have been found. In the summer of 2023, a documentary crew reached out to Sheriff Rivera. They were producing a series on cold cases in rural America, and they wanted to feature Brett Chandler's story. Rivera was hesitant at first. The case was still raw, the wounds still fresh, but eventually she agreed. The crew spent a week in Marlow Creek, filming interviews, capturing footage of the town, the auto shop, the barn where the truck had been found. They spoke with Rivera, with Garrett Bishop, with a few longtime residents who still remembered Brett. They traveled to New Mexico and filmed an interview with Raymond Cole in prison. He sat across from the camera, dressed in his prison uniform, and told his story again. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he'd told it so many times that it no longer felt real. The documentary aired in early 2024. It was titled Buried Truth: The Brett Chandler Case. It was well produced, well researched, and deeply emotional. It told the story chronologically, from Brett's disappearance in 1992 to the discovery of his truck in 2022, to the recovery of his remains and the trial of Raymond Cole. The episode ended with a shot of Brett's grave, the simple headstone standing alone in the quiet cemetery, the Texas wind blowing across the dry grass. The narrator's voice spoke over the image. Brett Chandler was a quiet man who lived a quiet life. He didn't seek attention. He didn't cause trouble. He simply existed, working his job, drinking his coffee, living his days in the small town he'd chosen to call home. And then, one summer afternoon, he witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see, and it cost him everything. A pause. For 30 years, Brett's story was buried alongside his body, but the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, has a way of surfacing. And in the end, Brett Chandler came home. The screen faded to black. The documentary brought renewed attention to the case. Online forums dedicated to true crime picked up the story. Armchair detectives dissected every detail, speculating about alternate theories, debating whether Raymond Cole was telling the whole truth, questioning whether there might have been others involved. But Rivera knew the truth. She'd investigated every angle, followed every lead, verified every claim. The story Raymond Cole told was consistent with the evidence. There were no loose ends, no unanswered questions. Brett Chandler had been killed by Eddie Rourke in July 1992. His body had been hidden in an abandoned well. His truck had been stashed in a barn, and for 30 years no one had known, until someone tore down that barn, and the silence finally broke. In the years that followed, Marlow Creek changed in small, almost imperceptible ways. New families moved in, old businesses closed. The town adapted, as small towns always do, to the slow passage of time. But Brett Chandler's name never fully disappeared. Every few years, someone would mention him. A new resident would hear the story and ask questions. A teacher at the high school would use the case as an example in a criminal justice class. A journalist would write an anniversary piece, marking another year since his remains were found. And each time, the story was told again. Not as a cautionary tale, not as a mystery, but as a reminder. A reminder that in small towns, where everyone knows everyone, secrets are still possible. That lives can vanish without a trace. That justice is not always swift, or certain, or complete. And that sometimes, the truth takes 30 years to surface. Sheriff Angela Rivera retired in 2028. She'd served as sheriff for 15 years, and the Brett Chandler case had been the defining moment of her career. She'd solved a 30-year-old cold case, brought closure to a community, and ensured that a man who'd spent decades hiding his guilt finally faced consequences. But she never felt like a hero, because the truth was, she hadn't solved the case. Garrett Bishop had. He'd found the truck. He'd called the police. He'd set everything in motion. Rivera had simply followed the evidence where it led. And in the end, that was all anyone could do. On a quiet afternoon, in October 2030, exactly 8 years after the truck was discovered, a woman named Claire Mercer visited Marlow Creek. She was Brett Chandler's second cousin, one of the few living relatives he'd had. She'd been a child when Brett disappeared, too young to remember him clearly, but she'd heard the stories. She'd watched the documentary. She'd read the articles, and she wanted to see the place where he'd lived, where he'd worked, where he'd died. She drove into town on a Sunday, when the streets were quiet and the shops were closed. She parked outside the old Henderson's auto shop, now a tire store. The building repainted. The sign changed. She stood there for a long time, staring at the building, imagining what had happened inside. Then she drove out to the cemetery. She found Brett's grave easily. It was well maintained, the grass trimmed, the headstone clean. Someone had left flowers there recently, fresh daisies in a small vase. Claire didn't know who'd left them. Maybe Garrett Bishop, maybe Sheriff Rivera, maybe just someone from town who remembered. She stood at the grave, hands in her pockets, and spoke aloud. "I don't really remember you, Brett," she said softly, "but I know you deserved better. You deserved a long life. You deserved to be happy, and I'm sorry you didn't get that." She paused, her throat tight. "But at least you're home now. At least people know your name. At least your story was told." She stayed there for a while, letting the wind move through the cemetery, letting the silence settle round her. Then she turned and walked back to her car. She didn't visit Marlow Creek again. Time continued to move forward. Years passed, decades passed. The people who'd known Brett Chandler grew old and died. The people who'd investigated his case retired and moved away. The town of Marlow Creek changed, slowly but inevitably, as all towns do. But the story remained, written in court record, preserved in documentary footage, carved into a headstone in a quiet cemetery. And every so often, someone would stumble across it. A student researching cold cases for a school project, a journalist looking for a compelling story, a curious stranger scrolling through true crime forums late at night. And they would read about Brett Chandler, a mechanic from a small Texas town who disappeared in 1992 and wasn't found until 2022. And they would ask the same question everyone asked: how does someone vanish for 30 years? The answer, of course, was simple. Because someone chose silence over truth. Because fear is a powerful motivator. Because the world is full of places where secrets can be buried, and people who are willing to bury them. But the other answer, the one that mattered more, was this: because eventually, someone decided to tear down a barn. Because someone found a truck covered in dust. Because someone called the police. Because someone told the truth. And because, in the end, silence always breaks. In the end, Brett Chandler's story was not about how he disappeared. It was about how he was found, and what it took for the truth to finally come to light. Sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried forever. Sometimes, 30 years later, a tarp is pulled back, and the silence speaks louder than any confession ever could.